Anybody that has heard of or practices agile will be familiar with the concept of a user story. A user story describes a feature from the end user perspective. In a user story, we describe who is this story for, what functionality is going to be delivered, and why it matters, and what is the value from it. It is all about conveying the value of what's going to be created. When we write user stories, they can be broad, and that is okay. These user stories should be broken down into smaller and workable pieces by the team when it makes sense. Working from a prioritized backlog of small user stories allows a team to get value and high-quality feedback on frequent intervals. We have seen many references to vertical and horizontal slicing, and we make the analogy with slicing the cake when talking about the vertical and horizontal slicing. Rather than giving the customer one layer of the cake at each time, in which case he will only taste one particular layer at a time, we want to give him a tiny piece of the whole cake, hence its name vertical slicing. In a horizontal slicing, the end user will have a chance to experience the system only when it is fully done. We create first the database, then other layers before we create the user interface. In a vertical slicing, the idea is to build it user story by user story, where each one will cross all horizontal layers. With the horizontal slicing, the feedback loop is long, which significantly increases the risk. The entire cake must be baked before the customer realizes that the cake he got is not necessarily the one he wanted. Maybe the customer preferred vanilla rather than chocolate in one of the cake layers. If he had the chance to taste one slice, he would have realized those gaps early on. One way to split user stories is by using the S.P.I.D.R. The P stands for path. If there are several possible alternatives path in a user story, one option is to create separate user stories from some of these paths. It is not absolutely necessary to write a story for each individual path, but just where it makes sense. If we take this example, as a customer, I want to be able to pay my goods online so that I do not have to transfer money. One path can be the happy flow. The happy flow describes how functionality behaves when everything goes well. In this case, we can have a first user story. As a customer, I want to be able to have a validation screen so that I can have full information on my order. And then the unhappy flow if there are any deviations, exceptions, or other problems. So a second user story could be, as a customer, I want to be able to see an error screen so that I can have a proof if my account is debited. We don't have to implement the full system, but only the part that shows that something went wrong. We can still split the happy flow in different other paths. One could be that the customer can pay using PayPal or credit card. Then with the credit card, we can first take into account Visa, then MasterCard. Again, keep in mind that we should split the user story only when it makes sense and when it is too big to fit in a sprint, for example. The I stands for interface. Most applications have to support various platforms, like mobile phones, desktops, tablets, or touchscreens. It may be beneficial to break down large items depending on the interface. For a mobile application, we can create a user story that relates exclusively to the use of Android devices, and then another one that focuses on iOS devices. In a desktop application, it can be split depending on the operating system. We can start with Windows, then Mac OS, then Linux. And for a web application, we can split by which browser is supported first. Google Chrome, Mozilla Firefox, Internet Explorer. Several ways to split a user story taking into consideration the interface. The prioritization of these user stories can depend on the target group, We can start with the ones that will impact the maximum amount of users before moving to the next ones. D stands for data. Some user stories can be split based on the data type they return or the parameters they are supposed to handle. Let's imagine the example of creating a web page for a banking platform, where the user needs to fill some information, such as the name, surname, date of birth, city, and the maximum amount of money he wants to be able to withdraw every month. The ideal web page is to have a text field for the name and the surname, having the possibility to open a calendar for date of birth, have a list of cities to choose from, and then having a cursor to be able to adjust the amount. Well, in a first user story, we can only create a basic form, where all of these items are text fields. The customer can still use it and fill up all the necessary information. Then in a second user story, we can add the possibility to pick dates from a calendar, a third user story to have a list of cities, and then a fourth one with the cursor for the amounts. Again, do not split user stories just for the sake of splitting, but only when it makes sense and when it is needed. If these three last user stories can be done in one single one, and it can be small enough, then no need to split it. R stands for rules. User stories often involve a number of explicit or implicit business rules. By studying these business rules, you might discover it is possible to break an item into smaller pieces of functionality. If the user story is about setting up a password, as a customer, I want to be able to set up my password so I can log in securely. A first rule is to have at least 7 characters in the password. A second rule could be to have special characters. A third rule is that the user can't use the last 3 passwords. And the last rule is to not have the name as a password. With this user story, it is fine if the team doesn't implement the 2 last rules from the beginning, allowing the user to create a password with only the first 2 rules, then a second user story with the other 2 rules, or even 1 user story per rule. And same thing, splitting the user stories by rule should be done only when it makes sense and when it is needed to make a user story smaller. Delivering these rules in an incremental way means that the initial user story is not immediately implemented completely, but instead delivered in several smaller steps. The last one is the spike. This is a term used in agile software development. Spikes are used to prototype the implementation of a functionality, and is typically used for the evaluation and feasibility of new technologies. When the team needs to build a functionality using either an old technology or a new technology, they can create spikes. Spikes involve investigations and building knowledge. The reason why I kept the spike at the end is that when the team is looking to split a user story, they should first start by using the other techniques before thinking about the spike. Spike should be used only if the team didn't manage to use the other methods. Once the team have a better understanding of the user story and the technology to be used with the spike, then they can work on splitting the initial user story using the other methods of the S.P.I.D.R. Splitting user stories is an important part of the work done by an agile team, and many teams tend to leave their user stories way too big to be completed faster. Working on smaller user stories help teams to get a fast feedback loop, as they can be completed faster. The product owner, stakeholders, and customers can test and give feedback as soon as possible, which will help the team to easily improve and correct things quicker. This is one of the ways that can help teams split their user stories, and almost every story can be split using one of these 5 techniques. I hope this video gave you a good understanding and a good starting point on how to split your user stories. Please leave us a comment if you want to learn more, and follow us for more content. Thank you!